The strange discovery. It was a chilly morning in October, and Jake, a sanitation worker, was starting his daily route. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, casting a warm glow on the streets. Jake loved his job. Every day brought new surprises and different stories from the neighborhoods he worked in. As he rolled his truck down the street, he waved to the familiar faces of children waiting for the school bus and greeted elderly neighbors sitting on their porches. Jake's first stop was a quiet block where he noticed the usual bins lined up neatly in front of each house. He hopped out of the truck and grabbed the first bin. It was light, filled mostly with newspapers and empty soda cans. He quickly dumped it into the truck and moved on to the next one. As he approached an older man's house at the end of the street, he noticed that the trash bin looked different. It was overflowing with items that didn't belong in a trash can. Curious, Jake stepped closer. The lid was slightly open, and he could see a child's toy peeking out. It was a bright red fire truck, its paint chipped and worn. Next to it was a photo album, the cover faded and frayed. Why would someone throw this away? Jake thought, feeling a strange knot in his stomach. He bent down to take a closer look and noticed something else. There were clothes crumpled at the bottom of the bin, some of them clearly too small for an adult. They looked like they belonged to a young child. Jake felt a wave of concern wash over him. He looked around the neighborhood, wondering if anyone else had noticed. It was early, and most people were still inside, preparing for their day. He reached into the bin and picked up the fire truck. It was still in good condition, and he knew it could bring joy to a child. The photo album intrigued him too. What memories were inside? As he set the toy aside, he suddenly felt uneasy. Why were these items thrown away? He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Jake glanced back at the house. It was a modest place, a bit run down, but it had a charm that spoke of better days. The paint was peeling and the garden was overgrown, but he noticed the curtains were drawn tight. After finishing his route, Jake couldn't stop thinking about the trash he had seen. His heart felt heavy as he recalled the old man's face. He had seen him around before, Mr. Thompson, an elderly man who lived alone. Jake wondered if the old man was okay. He remembered how he sometimes saw him sitting on the porch, lost in thought. Jake felt compelled to check on him. The next day, Jake decided to take a different route on his morning rounds. He wanted to see if Mr. Thompson was outside. As he approached the house, he saw the same curtains drawn shut. The lawn was unkempt, and there were no signs of life. Jake felt a pang of worry. He parked the truck and walked up to the door, hesitating for a moment before knocking. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Jake's concern deepened. What if something had happened to the old man? He remembered the strange items in the trash and thought it might be a good idea to check on him. Jake walked around to the side of the house, where he could see a window slightly ajar. He tiptoed closer and peered inside. The room was dim, but he could make out the shape of Mr. Thompson sitting in a chair, staring blankly at the wall. Jake's heart sank. He looked so alone, so lost. Jake felt a strong urge to help. But how? He decided to go back to his truck and call for help. But before he could move, he heard a noise from inside the house. It sounded like a muffled sob. Jake's heart raced. Was the old man in trouble? Should he go inside? As he stood there, he thought about what he could do. He remembered the old man's trash from the day before and how it seemed to tell a story. It wasn't just garbage. It was a sign of something deeper. Jake took a deep breath and made a decision. He couldn't just walk away. He needed to know if Mr. Thompson was okay. He walked back to the front door and knocked again. This time, he called out, "Mr. Thompson, are you in there?" After a moment, he heard shuffling from inside. The door creaked open slightly, and Mr. Thompson peered out, his eyes wide with surprise. "Who is it?" he asked, his voice shaky. "It's Jake, the sanitation worker. I saw some unusual things in your trash, and I wanted to check on you. Is everything okay?" Mr. Thompson hesitated, looking down at the floor. "I'm fine," he mumbled, but Jake could see the sadness in his eyes. "No, you're not. Please let me help you," Jake insisted gently. After a moment of silence, Mr. Thompson sighed and opened the door wider. "Okay, come in." As Jake stepped inside, he felt a mix of relief and worry. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew he had to do something. The strange discovery had led him here, and he was determined to uncover the truth. A hidden truth. As Jake stepped into Mr. Thompson's home, the first thing he noticed was the smell. It was a mixture of dust and something more pungent that he couldn't quite identify. The living room was dimly lit, and Jake's heart sank as he took in the sight. The room was cluttered with old newspapers, empty food containers, and a few personal items scattered around as if they had been abandoned over time. "Sorry about the mess," Mr. Thompson said, his voice barely above a whisper. He shuffled into the living room, leaning heavily on the armrest of his worn-out chair. "I haven't been able to keep up with things lately." Jake felt a wave of compassion wash over him. "It's okay, Mr. Thompson. We all have our tough days. Can I help you with anything?" Mr. Thompson looked at Jake, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't want to be a bother. You have your job to do." Jake shook his head. "You're not a bother at all. I'm just glad I stopped by." He gestured to the clutter. "This looks like a lot to handle alone. Is there someone who can help you?" The old man sighed deeply, as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. "No, not really. My family, they live far away. I don't want to worry them." His voice cracked slightly, and Jake could sense the sadness beneath the surface. "Maybe they'd want to know if you're having a hard time," Jake suggested gently. "You shouldn't have to go through this alone." Mr. Thompson looked away, staring at the wall. "It's just, I've been sick for a while now. I don't want to burden them." Jake's heart ached for the man. "You're not a burden. Everyone needs help sometimes. It's okay to ask for it." The old man nodded slowly but didn't respond. Instead, he pointed toward the cluttered table. "I haven't eaten much lately. Just some quick meals when I can manage." Jake's eyes fell on a few empty cereal boxes and a single, sad-looking apple sitting in a bowl. "Have you had breakfast today?" he asked. Mr. Thompson shook his head. "Not yet. Just didn't feel up to it." "Let me help you with that," Jake said, moving toward the kitchen. "I can make you something quick. How about some eggs and toast?" Mr. Thompson's eyes widened in surprise. "You don't have to do that." "I want to," Jake insisted. "Just sit back and relax." As Jake moved into the small kitchen, he noticed it was just as cluttered as the living room. Dishes piled high in the sink, and the counters were scattered with unopened mail. It was clear that Mr. Thompson had fallen behind on household chores. Jake found the eggs in the fridge and pulled out a couple of slices of bread. As he cracked the eggs into a pan, he could hear Mr. Thompson shuffling behind him, trying to help but clearly struggling. "Why don't you take a seat?" Jake suggested. "I've got this." Mr. Thompson hesitated, but eventually nodded, slowly making his way back to the living room. Jake finished cooking, the aroma of eggs and toast filling the air, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose in helping the old man. After a few minutes, he plated the food and carried it over to Mr. Thompson. "Here you go," he said, setting the plate on the small table in front of him. The old man looked at the meal, his eyes widening in disbelief. "You really didn't have to do this." "Thank you." Jake smiled. "Just eat. You need your strength." As Mr. Thompson began to eat, Jake took a seat across from him, watching as the old man took slow, deliberate bites. There was a quiet moment of comfort in the room, the tension easing a bit. After a while, Mr. Thompson put down his fork and looked at Jake. "You're a kind young man. It's rare to find someone willing to help these days." Jake shrugged, feeling a bit embarrassed. "I just believe everyone deserves a little kindness." "True," Mr. Thompson replied, his voice softening. "You know, I used to be a teacher. I always try to instill that in my students. Kindness can go a long way. Jake nodded. That's a great lesson. I think the world needs more of it. The conversation flowed easily, and for the first time, Mr. Thompson seemed to relax. He shared stories about his years as a teacher, the students he loved, and the memories he cherished. Jake listened intently, realizing how much Mr. Thompson had to offer despite his current situation. But then, as the old man talked, his expression shifted. A cloud seemed to pass over his face, and Jake could sense the change. I wish my wife were here to see this, Mr. Thompson said quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. Your wife? Jake asked gently, encouraging him to continue. She passed away a few years ago, Mr. Thompson said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. We were together for over 50 years. I didn't realize how lonely I would be without her. Jake's heart ached for him. I'm so sorry to hear that. It must be tough. Mr. Thompson nodded, looking down at his plate. It is. Some days are harder than others. It's just been difficult without someone to share my life with. Jake felt a wave of empathy wash over him. You don't have to face it alone, you know. There are people who care, and there are services that can help you. Mr. Thompson looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. I don't know. I've always prided myself on being independent. Asking for help feels wrong. It's not wrong to ask for help, Jake reassured him. Everyone needs support at some point. You've spent your life helping others. Let someone help you now. The old man considered Jake's words, and for the first time, he seemed to think about the possibility. The weight of loneliness felt a bit lighter, and hope began to bloom in the silence. As they sat together, the room filled with the warmth of connection. Jake realized that sometimes the simplest gestures could lead to profound changes. Today, he had not only discovered a strange situation, but also the importance of compassion and community. Little did he know that this was just the beginning of a journey that would reveal even deeper truths about Mr. Thompson's life and about himself. A call for help. After the unexpected moment of connection, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. The food had brought Mr. Thompson a little joy, but the conversation stirred something deeper. It was clear that the elderly man needed more than just a meal. He needed someone to truly listen and to help him through his struggles. As they finished their meal, Mr. Thompson leaned back in his chair, a look of contemplation on his face. Jake could see the gears turning in his mind, and he wondered what thoughts were passing through the old man's head. Jake, Mr. Thompson began, his voice wavering slightly. I appreciate you coming here today. It means more than you know. Jake smiled, feeling the warmth of Mr. Thompson's gratitude. I'm glad to be here. It's not often you get to connect with someone like this. Mr. Thompson sighed, his gaze drifting to the window. You know, I used to have so many friends, but as time went on, they slowly disappeared. I guess that's what happens when you get older. Jake nodded, understanding the loneliness that could creep in with age. It's tough, but I'm sure there are people who would be happy to help you if you reached out. The old man's face hardened slightly. I don't want to be a burden. I don't want anyone to pity me. Mr. Thompson, Jake said gently, accepting help isn't a sign of weakness. It takes strength to ask for support. You deserve care just like anyone else. Just then, Mr. Thompson's phone buzzed on the table, breaking the heavy atmosphere. He looked at it and frowned. It's just a telemarketer, he muttered, waving it off. But as the phone continued to buzz, Jake felt a strange sensation wash over him. Maybe you should answer it, he suggested. It might be someone important. Reluctantly, Mr. Thompson picked up the phone and answered. Hello, he said, his voice suddenly tight. Jake watched closely as Mr. Thompson's expression shifted from confusion to concern. He could hear the faint sound of a voice on the other end, and it sounded urgent. Is this Mr. Thompson? I'm calling about a report we received earlier today, the voice said. Jake leaned in, his heart racing. What report? He thought. He could sense that something was off, and the tension in the room thickened. "Yes, I'm here," Mr. Thompson replied, his voice shaky. "What is this about?" The voice continued, and Jake could see Mr. Thompson's face pale as he listened. I don't understand. You have to be mistaken." "What is it?" Jake asked, sensing the unease radiating from the old man. "It's about your neighbor," Mr. Thompson said slowly, his eyes wide with shock. "What did you say happened?" Jake's mind raced. Had something happened to someone in the neighborhood? What kind of report could cause such distress? The voice on the other end spoke again, but Jake couldn't hear the words clearly. He could only see Mr. Thompson's expression as it turned from confusion to fear. No, you have to check again. That can't be right." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Something was seriously wrong. "Mr. Thompson, what's going on?" The old man ended the call and looked at Jake, his hands trembling. "I don't know how to tell you this, but my neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, she's gone missing." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Jake's heart sank. "What do you mean gone missing?" "She was supposed to meet with me for coffee this morning," Mr. Thompson explained, his voice shaking. "When she didn't show up, I thought maybe she was just running late. But now, they're saying they found her car abandoned near the park." Jake felt a wave of panic wash over him. "That's terrible. Do they think something happened to her?" Mr. Thompson nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "They think she may have been taken. They're worried she's in danger." Jake's heart raced. "What can we do? Is there anyone we can call to help?" Mr. Thompson rubbed his temples, clearly overwhelmed. "The police are already looking into it, but I can't just sit here. I need to do something." Without thinking, Jake stood up. "Then let's go look for her. We can check the park together. Maybe she's just lost and needs help." Mr. Thompson hesitated, looking uncertain. "I don't know. What if it's too dangerous?" "We can't just wait," Jake insisted, his determination growing. "We have to try. If she's missing, she needs all the help she can get." After a moment, Mr. Thompson nodded, his expression shifting from fear to resolve. "You're right. Let's go." Jake felt a surge of adrenaline as they hurried out of the house. Together, they made their way to the park, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against time. As they walked, Jake asked Mr. Thompson more about Mrs. Jenkins. "How long have you known her?" "Oh, for years," Mr. Thompson replied. "We used to take walks together every week. She was like family to me." "Was there anything unusual going on? Any signs that she might be in trouble?" Jake asked, trying to piece together the puzzle. Mr. Thompson shook his head. "No, she seemed fine. We were planning to go to the farmer's market next week." As they reached the park, the atmosphere felt heavy with tension. Jake scanned the area, looking for any sign of Mrs. Jenkins. They approached the playground where children were playing, their laughter a stark contrast to the seriousness of the situation. "Maybe she's sitting on a bench or something," Jake suggested, hoping for the best. But as they walked deeper into the park, the reality set in. There was no sign of Mrs. Jenkins. Panic surged within Jake as he realized how dire the situation was. They needed to act quickly. "We should call the police again," Jake urged. "They need to know we're out here looking for her." Mr. Thompson pulled out his phone, his hands shaking. As he dialed, Jake's heart raced. They had to find her before it was too late. The park felt eerily quiet as they continued their search, the weight of the unknown looming over them. Little did they know that their search would lead to unexpected discoveries, testing their courage and resolve in ways they never imagined. The search intensifies. Jake and Mr. Thompson stood in the park, the air thick with tension and worry. Jake's heart raced as he scanned the surroundings, searching for any sign of Mrs. Jenkins. It felt as if time was slipping away from them, and the urgency of the situation pressed down heavily on his shoulders. "Is there anywhere else she might have gone?" Jake asked, trying to keep the conversation flowing and Mr. Thompson's spirits up. Mr. Thompson shook his head, his brow furrowed in worry. She always took the same route to the park. She would never just disappear like this. As the old man spoke, Jake noticed a group of people gathered near the park entrance. His instincts kicked in. Let's check over there. Maybe they've seen her. They hurried toward the crowd, which consisted of concerned neighbors and a couple of police officers. The officers were speaking with a woman who seemed visibly upset. As Jake and Mr. Thompson approached, they overheard snippets of conversation. I saw her walking this morning, but I thought she was just going for her usual walk, the woman said, tears in her eyes. Do you remember what she was wearing? One of the officers asked. The woman shook her head. I wasn't really paying attention. I just assumed she was fine. Jake felt a surge of frustration mixed with fear. Excuse me. He called out to the officers. We're looking for Mrs. Jenkins. Do you have any updates? One of the officers turned to them, his expression serious. We're gathering information from people who may have seen her. It's important that we have as many details as possible. Mr. Thompson stepped forward. She was supposed to meet me for coffee, but she never showed up. Now we're really worried. The officer nodded. We understand. If you have any additional information, please share it with us. We need to act quickly. As they spoke, Jake's eyes wandered around the park. A couple of children played on the swings, and a few people walked their dogs, seemingly oblivious to the unfolding crisis. He wondered how many of them realized that an elderly woman might be in danger. Do you think she might have gone to the cafe? Jake asked, glancing at Mr. Thompson. The old man thought for a moment. It's possible. She loves their coffee. Maybe we should check there. Without hesitation, Jake and Mr. Thompson turned to the officers. We're going to check the cafe. If you hear anything, please let us know, Jake said urgently. The officers nodded, encouraging them to keep searching. As they made their way out of the park, Jake couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Every second felt critical, and he wanted to do everything he could to help. When they arrived at the cafe, Jake opened the door, and the bell above chimed softly. The warm aroma of coffee filled the air, but the atmosphere felt heavy. A few patrons glanced up as they entered, their expressions curious. Mr. Thompson approached the counter, his eyes scanning the room. Have you seen Mrs. Jenkins? He asked the barista, a young woman with bright blue hair. The barista frowned, shaking her head. I haven't seen her today. Is everything okay? No, she's gone missing, Jake replied, his voice edged with urgency. We think she might have come here. Can you check the security footage? The barista nodded, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. Of course. I'll see if I can pull it up. While she worked, Mr. Thompson paced nervously, wringing his hands together. Jake could see the worry etched on his face. She's always been so independent. I can't believe this is happening. Just then, the barista returned, her face pale. I found something. You need to see this. She led them to a small room at the back where a security monitor displayed footage from the cafe. They watched intently as the screen showed customers coming and going. There. That's her. Jake pointed as Mrs. Jenkins appeared on the screen, entering the cafe with her usual bright smile. She looks fine, Mr. Thompson said, a glimmer of hope lighting up his eyes. But as they continued to watch, the scene shifted. The footage showed Mrs. Jenkins sitting at a table, sipping coffee and chatting with someone. Suddenly, a man Jake had never seen before leaned in close, and their conversation seemed intense. What is she talking about? Jake murmured, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. The barista fast-forwarded the footage, and Jake's heart sank as the man suddenly grabbed Mrs. Jenkins' arm and pulled her out of her seat. Wait, what's happening? Mr. Thompson gasped, his face draining of color. They look like they're arguing, Jake said, feeling a wave of panic wash over him. As they watched, the man pulled Mrs. Jenkins toward the exit, and she seemed reluctant to go with him. Stop the tape, Jake shouted. The barista froze the footage, and they all stared at the screen, disbelief settling in. "This isn't right," Jake said, his heart pounding. "We need to tell the police." Mr. Thompson nodded, urgency in his voice. "They need to know who that man is. He could be the one who took her." Jake turned to the barista. "Can you print a still image from this footage? We need to show it to the officers." The barista quickly complied, her hands shaking as she worked the printer. Moments later, she handed Jake a photo of the man. "Here, take this. I hope it helps." Jake and Mr. Thompson rushed out of the cafe, adrenaline coursing through their veins. They needed to get back to the police and share what they had discovered. As they hurried back to the park, Jake felt a mix of fear and determination. They were one step closer to finding Mrs. Jenkins, but they had to act fast. Time was running out, and they couldn't let anything stop them from uncovering the truth. Little did they know, the search for Mrs. Jenkins would lead them to unexpected twists, revealing a shocking connection that would change everything. The unexpected revelation. As Jake and Mr. Thompson rushed back to the park, the tension hung thick in the air. Each step felt heavy with the weight of uncertainty. Jake clutched the photo of the mysterious man, determined to get it into the hands of the police. "Do you think she's okay?" Mr. Thompson asked, worry etched across his weathered face. "I hope so," Jake replied, though doubt gnawed at him. "But we have to find her before it's too late." When they reached the park, the police officers were still gathering information from the small crowd that had formed. Jake spotted one of the officers, Officer Harris, and quickly approached him. "Officer Harris," Jake called out, waving the photograph. "We found something important." Officer Harris turned, his expression shifting from concern to interest. "What do you have?" Jake held out the picture, breathless. "This is a man we saw in the cafe. He was with Mrs. Jenkins. It looks like he was trying to take her away." Officer Harris took the photo, studying it closely. "Do you have any details about the encounter?" Mr. Thompson jumped in, his voice shaking. "We saw them arguing. She looked scared, and he was forceful." The officer nodded, understanding the urgency. "I'll send this to the station immediately. We'll put out an alert. If anyone sees this man, they need to call us right away." Jake felt a surge of hope. "Thank you. Please find her." Officer Harris assured them he would do everything he could and quickly moved to relay the information to his team. Just then, Jake noticed a woman approaching. She looked familiar, but he couldn't place her. As she came closer, he realized it was Mrs. Jenkins' neighbor, Mrs. Robinson. "Mr. Thompson." "Jake." Mrs. Robinson called out, her voice filled with concern. "I heard what happened. Is there any news?" "We're trying to find her," Mr. Thompson replied, worry deepening in his voice. "She was last seen with this man." He pointed to the photo that Officer Harris was still holding. Mrs. Robinson gasped. "I think I know him. I've seen him hanging around the neighborhood before. He seemed shady." "Do you know his name?" Jake asked, leaning in. "No, but I think he was talking to someone in our building. Maybe they can help," Mrs. Robinson suggested. "Let's go," Jake urged, eager to follow any lead that might help find Mrs. Jenkins. They quickly made their way to the building where Mrs. Robinson lived, which was just a few blocks away. As they entered the lobby, Jake felt a sense of urgency. They needed answers fast. Mrs. Robinson knocked on a few doors, but many residents were either not home or unwilling to help. After several minutes, they reached a door at the end of the hallway. "Mr. Delgado, are you there?" Mrs. Robinson called. A moment later, a tall man with graying hair opened the door. "Yes. What's going on?" "We're looking for Mrs. Jenkins. She's gone missing, and we think you might know something," Mrs. Robinson said, her voice steady. Mr. Delgado's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "I did see a man with her. He looked out of place." Jake felt a surge of hope. "What can you tell us about him?" "I only saw them once. I was coming back from the store, and he was standing too close to her, almost like he was waiting for her to leave. It made me uncomfortable," Mr. Delgado said, his brow furrowing. Did you see what they were talking about? Jake pressed, desperate for any details. No, but I did notice that they seemed to be arguing. Mr. Delgado continued. I didn't think much of it at the time. I thought he was just a concerned friend. Mr. Thompson's face hardened. He's not a friend. He's dangerous. Mr. Delgado nodded slowly. I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner. I should have reported it. Jake felt frustration bubbling inside him, but he knew they had to keep focused. Do you remember anything else? Maybe a description or a name? Mr. Delgado thought for a moment. Then his eyes widened. I think he mentioned a street name. Something like Maple. I don't remember much more, but it stuck with me. Maple Street, Jake repeated, trying to connect the dots. Do you think he lives around there? It's possible, Mr. Delgado said. I'll help you look if you'd like. Thank you, Jake said, gratitude washing over him. Let's head over there now. They quickly left the building and walked toward Maple Street, hope fueling their urgency. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows as they made their way. As they walked, Jake's mind raced with possibilities. What if they found Mrs. Jenkins? What if they didn't? He couldn't let those thoughts distract him. They had to remain focused. When they reached Maple Street, it was quiet. Rows of houses lined the street, each one looking similar to the last. They walked slowly, searching for any sign of the man from the photo. Suddenly, Jake spotted a figure standing in front of a house. It was the man from the cafe. Heart racing, he whispered to Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Robinson, "That's him." The man turned suddenly, as if sensing their gaze. Jake's pulse quickened as he took a step back, hoping they weren't seen. "Should we call the police?" Mr. Thompson asked, worry creeping into his voice. "Let's see what he does first," Jake replied, trying to remain calm. They watched as the man glanced around nervously, then hurried inside the house. "Now," Jake said, adrenaline pumping through him, "we need to call the police and tell them where he is." They quickly pulled out their phones, ready to report their findings. Jake's heart raced as he dialed, praying that they weren't too late. The race against time. Jake's heart raced as he held his phone tightly, waiting for the officer to answer. He glanced at Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Robinson, both of them visibly anxious. The man from the photo had just gone inside the house, and every second felt crucial. Finally, Officer Harris picked up. "This is Officer Harris." "Officer, it's Jake again," he said, urgency spilling into his voice. "We found the man. He just entered a house on Maple Street." "Which house?" Officer Harris asked, his tone shifting to professional seriousness. It's the one with the blue door, number 42. Please hurry. We think he has Mrs. Jenkins," Jake exclaimed, feeling a knot of fear tightening in his stomach. "Stay put and don't approach. We're sending the unit right now," Officer Harris instructed, his voice steady. Jake nodded, though he knew Officer Harris couldn't see him. "Okay, we'll wait here." He hung up, feeling a mix of relief and impatience. "They're on their way," he said, trying to keep the worry off his face. Mrs. Robinson looked between the house and Jake. "What if he hurts her? We can't just stand here." "Let's just stay calm," Mr. Thompson said. "The police are trained for this. We don't want to make things worse." As they stood there, watching the house, Jake felt the minutes stretch into eternity. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, painting the clouds in shades of pink and orange. With every moment, his anxiety grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Suddenly, they heard sirens in the distance. Jake's heart leaped. "They're coming." The sound grew louder, and soon a police car pulled up in front of the blue door. 2 officers hopped out, instantly surveying the area. Jake felt a rush of hope. Help was finally here. Officer Harris emerged from the car and approached Jake, his expression serious. "Where's the suspect?" "He just went inside," Jake pointed. "We think he has Mrs. Jenkins. He was arguing with her at the cafe, and we saw him come here." "Stay back," Officer Harris ordered as he and his partner moved toward the house, weapons drawn and ready. Jake held his breath, the tension palpable as the officers approached the door. They knocked loudly, calling out, "Police, open up." Silence hung in the air, and Jake felt his stomach twist with dread. What if he tries to hurt her? He whispered to Mr. Thompson. "Just trust the police," Mr. Thompson replied, his voice steady but anxious. After a moment, Officer Harris turned to his partner. "Let's try to get a visual from the side." They moved quickly, shifting to the side of the house to find a window. Jake and the others followed, watching from a safe distance as the officers crouched low. They could see the shadows moving inside, but it was hard to make out any details. Then suddenly, they heard a loud crash from inside. Jake's heart stopped. "What was that?" he gasped. Officer Harris moved quickly, signaling for backup. "Stay here," he shouted to Jake and the others. He moved to the front of the house, ready to take action. Jake couldn't just stand there. He took a few cautious steps closer, determined to find out what was happening. Mr. Thompson grabbed his arm. "No, Jake. We need to wait." But before Jake could respond, he saw Officer Harris burst through the front door, shouting commands. "Get on the ground. Now." Moments later, Jake saw the man from the photo struggling against the officers, trying to escape. "This is it," he thought, fear and adrenaline coursing through him. "Where's Mrs. Jenkins?" Officer Harris demanded, wrestling the man to the ground. The man screamed something incoherent, but Jake couldn't make out the words. Just then, another officer emerged from the back of the house, looking serious. "We found her." Jake's heart raced with a mix of hope and anxiety. "Is she okay?" he called out, his voice shaking. The officer nodded, his expression softening. "She's safe, just a little shaken up, but she's okay." Relief washed over Jake like a wave. He exhaled slowly, feeling tears of gratitude stinging his eyes. Mrs. Jenkins was safe. A few moments later, another officer escorted Mrs. Jenkins outside. She looked pale, her eyes wide with confusion. But when she spotted Jake and the others, a wave of recognition crossed her face. "Jake," she called out, her voice trembling. "I'm so glad to see you." Jake rushed toward her. "We were so worried. Are you okay?" Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her voice shaky. "I'm fine here, just a little scared. Thank you for helping me." The officers led the man out, handcuffed and looking defiant. "You're making a big mistake," he yelled, but no one was paying him any attention. Officer Harris turned to Mrs. Jenkins. "We're going to take you to a safe place for now. Do you need any medical assistance?" "No, I'm all right," she said, her voice regaining strength. "Just a bit shaken up." As the police prepared to take the man away, Jake felt a sense of victory. They had found Mrs. Jenkins, and she was safe. "Thank you, Jake," Mrs. Jenkins said, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You and your friends saved me." Jake smiled, feeling proud. "I'm just glad you're okay." As the officers began to leave, Jake knew this was not just a victory for Mrs. Jenkins, but for the entire community. They had come together to help one another, and in doing so, they had created a stronger bond. With relief washing over him, Jake looked around at Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Robinson. They were all safe, and that was what mattered most. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood as the police drove away, leaving hope in their wake. A new beginning. In the days that followed the shocking events at Mr. Thompson's house, the neighborhood buzzed with chatter. News of Mrs. Jenkins' rescue spread quickly, and Jake felt a wave of pride whenever he heard someone mention his name. He had played a part in saving someone's life, and it felt incredible. Jake, Mr. Thompson, and Mrs. Robinson frequently visited Mrs. Jenkins. Each time, she greeted them with warm smiles and heartfelt gratitude. She often invited them to sit and enjoy some homemade cookies or lemonade on her porch. The laughter they shared helped ease the tension of the past few days. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, Jake, Mr. Thompson, and Mrs. Robinson sat on the porch enjoying the cool breeze. Mrs. Jenkins looked thoughtful, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. "You know," she began, "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years, but I never really knew my neighbors well. I was so caught up in my own world. This whole incident has opened my eyes." Mr. Thompson nodded. "It's true. Sometimes we get so busy that we forget to look out for each other. This has brought us all closer." Mrs. Robinson smiled. "It's like a reminder that we need to stay connected. We're all part of this community, and we should support one another." Jake listened intently, feeling a sense of belonging. "I think we should do something special for the neighborhood. Maybe a block party," he suggested, his eyes shining with excitement. Mrs. Jenkins perked up at the idea. "That's a wonderful idea, Jake. We could invite everyone, share food, and play games. It would be a great way to bring everyone together and celebrate our community." The group began brainstorming ideas, their excitement growing with each suggestion. They decided to hold the block party the following Saturday. Each neighbor could bring a dish to share, and they would set up games for kids and activities for adults. As the week went by, the preparations took shape. Flyers were made, inviting everyone to join the fun. Jake felt a sense of responsibility and joy as he helped organize everything. He spent hours with Mr. Thompson, decorating the park where they would hold the party. Finally, Saturday arrived, bright and sunny. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Jake woke up early, filled with excitement. He and his parents helped set up tables, chairs, and colorful decorations. Soon, the sound of laughter and chatter filled the air as neighbors began to arrive. Mrs. Jenkins had prepared her famous lemonade, while Mrs. Robinson brought a large tray of cookies. Mr. Thompson grilled burgers and hot dogs, filling the air with delicious scents. Jake helped with the games, setting up a ring toss and a water balloon toss that children eagerly lined up for. As the day unfolded, neighbors mingled, sharing stories and laughter. The atmosphere felt warm and welcoming. Jake noticed how everyone was smiling, how the events of the past week seemed to fade away. After a few hours of games and food, Jake stood on a small bench to get everyone's attention. "Can I have everyone's attention, please?" he called out, feeling nervous but excited. The crowd quieted down, turning their faces toward him. "Thank you all for coming today. We've all gone through something difficult recently, but look at us now. We're together, supporting each other. This block party is a way to celebrate our community and remind us how important it is to look out for one another." Cheers erupted, and people clapped, their smiles brightening the atmosphere even more. "And let's give a special shout-out to Mrs. Jenkins," Jake continued, pointing toward her. "Thank you for being such a wonderful neighbor." Everyone cheered for Mrs. Jenkins, who beamed with joy and waved back. As the party continued, Jake watched everyone enjoying themselves. He felt a sense of fulfillment that he had never experienced before. The bond they had formed during the crisis had turned into something beautiful. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jake sat with his friends, taking it all in. "We should make this a yearly thing," he suggested, smiling. Mrs. Robinson nodded. "I agree. It's a great way to keep our community strong." "Let's call it the Neighbors' Day," Mr. Thompson added. "A day for everyone to come together and celebrate." As the evening went on, they made plans for next year's event, filled with laughter and hope for the future. Jake felt a warmth in his heart, knowing that this was just the beginning of a new chapter for their neighborhood. From that day on, Jake was determined to keep the spirit of togetherness alive. He understood now how important it was to connect with those around him and support one another through thick and thin. The bond they formed during a time of crisis became a source of strength, and Jake knew they could face any challenge together. As the stars twinkled overhead, Jake realized that true community was not just about living near one another. It was about caring for each other, standing together, and celebrating the good times. He couldn't wait to see what the future held for him and his friends in their little corner of the world.